This week on the Wheelhouse.
I'm 20.
I'm also 20.
We're both 20.
Okay. So you're both Gen Z.
I'm 61.
What generation are you a part of?
X. A lot of the younger generation is lacking a strong work ethic.
Well, I do think that there's a lot of condescension that happens from older generations towards Gen Z.
I'm definitely concerned about LGBTQ rights.
Immigration.
Gun violence.
Politically, the biggest thing is the state of our court system.
Are you planning to vote in this election?
Oh, yeah. Because we have to keep our country from going to crap.
Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z. It's politics across the generations. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people and the generations. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. In a year where we've talked about age really constantly, we've also heard conversations about wide gaps in how different generations view politics. Is Gen Z more likely to favor activism than millennials? Is Gen X the most conservative generation? Are baby boomers the generation most focused on the economy? Maybe you identify with the stereotypes about your generation, or maybe you don't. But when it comes to the United States political landscape, there's more than just a divide between the right and the left. There could be a large generational divide, too. And to get us started, we're going to look at where these generational beliefs begin. With me this morning, three esteemed guests, very lucky to have. Sally Friedman, Associate Professor with the University of Albany's Department of Political Science. Sally is also the editor of Generations in American Politics with David Schultz. Welcome to the Wheelhouse, Sally.
Thanks.
Elena Moore, political reporter covering new voters and the 2024 election for NPR's Washington desk, focusing her reporting on new voters and youth politics. Elena, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
And Jean Twenge is a professor of psychology at San Diego State University who wrote a book called Generations, The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence, and What They Mean for America's Future. Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me.
So happy to have this conversation. Jean, before we dive into some of the political beliefs amongst the different generations, let's start with the basics. How old approximately are folks who are in the silent generation? How old are the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z?
Yeah, so the silent generation is those born 1925 to 1945. So the youngest are already in their late 70s. So then the boomers, born 1946 to 1964. So they are about 60 to in their 70s. Then Gen X, I use 1965 to 1979. And so they're 45 to 59 years old. Millennials, born 1980 to 1994. The Pew Center puts their cutoff a little bit later, but based on some trends in the data, I think that millennials end with those around 1994. So their age is 30 to 44. And then Gen Z, who I originally called iGen, I define them as born 1995 to 2012. So they are ages 12 to 29.
We want to kind of get into that stereotyping that we were talking about earlier, or at least asking people how they identify with the generation that they're a part of. Are there certain ways that you all think that you may identify with the generation that you are a part of? We'll start with you, Sally.
Yeah, I'm a baby boomer and I'm proud of it.
Yeah.
And I know I was influenced by the 60s. I know the Kennedy president and the assassination. And I was thinking about this before the program. The Vietnam War dissent stuff was when I was in college. So when I was thinking of events and generations, yes, the first thing I thought of was my own. And then the differences within generations too.
Let's go to Gene Twangy out there in California. Gene, what about you and your generation?
I'm a Gen Xer, which at least I define as those born 1965 to 1979. So we're the generation after the boomers and before the millennials, and everybody forgets about us. We're the middle child of generations, both literally with two adult generations older than us and two younger than us. But we kind of like being ignored. We like flying under the radar and letting the boomers and millennials fight it out while we do our own thing and can get away with that.
As one youngish Gen Xer told me on the streets of Bridgeport, Connecticut, Gen X, we just don't care. That's what the reaction I got from that guy was. Elena, Gen Z, I believe.
Yeah, I'm a cusper. So, I'm at the very end of the millennials, very beginning of Gen Z. I'm in my late 20s. So I think that, kind of a little bit of both generations of I've grown up with technology for nearly all of my life. But as this kind of cusper, I do remember the times before having cell phones, and I memorized my home phone number, very, very distant memories of dial-up internet. But the thing I would resonate with the most of this generation is just we have become adults in a very tumultuous time in political society. And that's something I've heard from the folks that I talk to on the regular, young voters across the country. Regardless of your politics, you have become an adult during a time where politics is everywhere, and it's on your phones. And even if you are somebody who is not a news junkie, it's likely you see a version of the news in your content. And that's, I think, what I would say resonates the most.
Sally, in doing your work and really being dedicated to studying each generation, how do researchers go about tracking themes or similarities amongst age groups, particularly in a time where we're so careful to not stereotype individuals and make large generalizations?
So one of the things that impressed me the most as I was reading other people's articles and working on my own stuff was just the complexity, the extent to which while you're looking at generations, other variables, gender, race, whole bunch of other urban, rural, demographics matter, life cycle effects matter, period effects matter. So I was driving myself crazy for a little bit trying to figure this out, but certainly surveys of different age groups, certainly panel studies that track people over time, cohorts. But I guess I was impressed, come to the conclusion that generations matter, but try to parse out their effects is really more complex, at least as I see it, than I thought.
Gene, when does a generation begin to develop political inclinations?
Most of the studies suggest that awareness really clicks in during adolescence. And there's some studies to suggest that adolescence and young adulthood are really critical periods for forming attitudes around politics. So there's one big analysis that suggests that generations or cohorts lean, say, Democrat or Republican, based on the political party and the popularity of who was president when they were in those crucial years of adolescence and young adulthood. So that's one reason, for example, why Gen X tends to lean Republican, is because Gen Xers were teenagers and young adults when Ronald Reagan was president, a very popular Republican president. Millennials tend to tilt more toward the Democrat side arguably because they were young when Barack Obama was president. For Gen Z, I think it's going to be anybody's guess because we've had Trump and Biden, and neither one of them have been particularly popular.
How does the first president we remember having during our childhood impact our beliefs down the road?
There's not really much data on that. And I think, too, we also have to take a step back and consider that big question of like what makes a generation different in the first place. And there has been historically a lot of focus on these types of things, like who was president, what are the big events that you experienced as a child, as an adolescent, as a young adult. So things like wars and pandemics and protests and so on. But I think that misses the big picture by a mile, because if you really think about what makes generations, it's that you live in a different time. And why is it different to live now compared to 200 years ago or 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 20 years ago? The answer to that question isn't big events, it's technology. Not just smartphones and computers and the internet, but also better medical care, faster transportation, labor-saving devices. That's what makes my life completely different from my grandmother's life. Technology and its downstream effects. Things like because we live longer, we take longer to develop and do adult things, and to marry and to have children, and that we focus more on the individual because we can due to our technological society. So I think those end up influencing politics much more than just who is president when you were young.
Elena, diving into some of the racial and ethnic demographic differences between the generations, if possible, steadily getting more diverse with each generation, what kind of impact is this having, at least on how people view candidates?
Well, I mean, we have seen that Gen Z and millennials are expected to make up a larger portion of the electorate in the coming elections. And, I think by the next decade, they're going to surpass 50%. Gen Z is also like an incredibly diverse generation as it grows. And so we'll have to see how people's, diverse experiences coming from different race and ethnic backgrounds affects their vote. Obviously, we've seen just in past exit polls that especially young voters of color have played a really crucial role in turnout in some battleground states, as has the larger generation. But I think continuing to appeal to young voters more broadly is one thing, but making sure that the generation isn't seen as a monolith and that, different communities of young people are reached out to by politicians. I think that's something I'm going to be watching for, as this generation becomes a bigger and bigger part of political life.
For this show, I had to confront my own generation here, being a millennial. And in talking in advance of the show about some big events, I'm thinking about how Gen Zers are doing these shooting drills, and the younger millennials did that as well. And then in the Cold War era, there were folks that had to hide under desks and things like that in school. And we really only had fire drills when I was a kid. So I was very lucky, I guess, and very privileged to be doing that. I'm thinking about the worst thing that's ever happened in my life in terms of society, besides the obvious events like 9/11, is just like people being so angsty and always wearing flannel in the 90s. But I had fun a little bit thinking about that. And then I had fun producing this next montage that you're going to hear. We did a little Wheelhouse in the Wild trip, myself and two of our awesome Connecticut public reporters, Abby Brown and Eddie Martinez, got out on the streets and asked folks to talk about what generation they're a part of and how it shapes their politics.
My name is Liliana Restrepo.
My name is Cedar, Greve. I'm 20.
I'm also 20.
We're both 20.
Okay, so you're both Gen Z.
Luanne, Sforza.
What generation are you a part of?
Well, I'm over 65.
Antrice, Antrice, last name Cone, Cone.
What event in your lifetime, in your life, has kind of shaped some of your views?
I would say going into 2010 to like now.
Risa Sorge, Risasorge. I was born I'm 61.
There's one thing that you think has kind of shaped your views. What do you think it is?
Trump is president.
Being in childhood during such a unprecedented amount of school shootings, really, and mass shootings in general, like I feel like that is really scary and really like drives me to want to vote.
Growing up with a lot of school shootings and like the discussion about abortion, and so I think like that influences like what I'm passionate about. And then I think like the perspective, especially like as a queer person from a lot of older people, is like, oh, like that's fake, like, oh, that doesn't really matter, or like we can't talk about it because it'll like, I don't know, like there's a lot of like misconceptions.
It was just post-Vietnam for me. I wasn't in Vietnam. I was just after that. But, I'm just very much aware of how involved young people were demonstrating what they felt. And I think today young people are kind of taking it on the road, but I think they need to more so. Climate change, things that are affecting the world.
RANDYWEIS.
Oh, I'm Valerie Fallon.
And what generation do you feel like you
I'm in the
belong
50s.
So that would make you Gen X?
That's right.
X.
Are you comfortable sharing how old you are?
I'm 44.
And what do you think defines your generation? It's a very open-ended question, but
I think it's the end of the era where, we're not entitled. That's the last generation of entitlement.
A lot of the younger generation is lacking is a strong work ethic.
Preston, Siroka.
Samuel Zwick-Lavinsky. Well, I do think that there's a lot of condescension that happens from older generations towards Gen Z.
I don't know. I feel that they probably view us more, not unknowledged, but in kind of a different sense.
We talked to 10 people that day, so it's a very low sample. You're not going to get anything scientific out of there. We spoke to, I believe it was 2 boomers, 2 Gen Xers, 1 millennial, and then 5 Gen Zers. And we asked pretty much everybody that was walking by if we could talk. So, Gene Twangy, nothing there that I can say is scientific based on my sample. But is there anything that caught your ear throughout that feature?
The work ethic part is unfortunately true by what young people say about themselves now compared to, say, 18-year-olds 10 years ago. And it's recent. So it's a big survey I work with, nationally representative of high school seniors, and they're asking a bunch of questions about work. And one of them is, are you willing to work overtime? And that had actually been rising a little bit, but then it just fell off a cliff in 2021 and 2022, like a post-pandemic effect, apparently, where there's just been a really big reconsideration of work. And, how you see that is, I think, may depend on your generation, may depend on whether you're a manager or employee, because managers look at that and go, oh my gosh, this is going to be so challenging, and try to motivate this generation. And and then it can veer into stereotypes and negativity. But they do have a point that, they may be seeing this. But then a lot of Gen Zers will say, look, we don't want to work ourselves to death the way our parents did and our grandparents did. And that's not the way we want to live our lives. And we want better work-life balance. And I think you step back, you can say that both have points. Both are right.
We spoke to 5 Gen Zers. You only heard from 4 of them in that clip. Did anything catch your ear in there, Elena?
I think similarly, the work ethic was interesting. I think something that I hear a lot about is just concern and anxiety for folks' political future, but also just like how they're going to figure it out, how they're going to afford things, how they're going to find the job, how they're going to pay their student loans. And I think it's like potentially tied into that same work ethic question of, there's a lot kind of impending like in the future for them. And especially when some of these people have grown up with maybe their parent lost a job during the Great Recession, or, their older sibling couldn't find a job out of college. I think there is maybe, an effect on that, or there could be. And so I found that interesting. I also think I've definitely talked to people who know that Gen Z has a reputation of this new generation, very online, unique in how it defines itself, a little out there. And so I think I've definitely met people who hear the criticisms of their generation, but are also very proud to be Gen Z.
Here's an example of a mistake that I made in thinking about this when we went out and talked to people. I had figured that people were going to talk about something that was maybe closer to childhood or something that was a long time ago when thinking about experiences. And Risa Sorge down in Trumbull tells us she's 61 years old and she is a boomer. She doesn't talk about something that happened a while back. She's talking about the recent presidency of former President Donald Trump. Sally, any takeaways that you had from listening to that clip?
Yeah, I noticed that too. Yeah, generations and formative events matter, but life cycle things can change as you go. So I noticed that too. And the other thing, I think it was the last gentleman said something about, well, that's how we're perceived. So you have issues of, what each member of a generation sees themselves as, but you also have how do other people see that generation, whether it's right or wrong.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Today's show is all about when politics and generations collide. Our experts have broken down where generations' political systems stem from, but coming up, we're going to fast forward to today. Got an important election looming, right? And we'll talk about some of the polarization across the ages. Stick with us. You're listening to The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Boomers, Gen X, Millennials. Today we're talking about different generations, how their politics are formed, how each generation is contributing to our political landscape. With me today, three experts on this topic. Sally Friedman, Associate Professor within the University of Albany's Department of Political Science. Elena Moore, political reporter covering the 2024 election for NPR's Washington desk. And Jean Twangy, Professor of Psychology at San Diego State University. Sometimes it feels like things are more polarized today than they've been in the past. Just within the past few weeks, we had an assassination attempt on a former president. We saw the current president drop out of the upcoming race at a later time than any other president in American history. Opinions on all this are divided, so let's try to get into this. Elena, I want to start with Gen Z. We had the opportunity to hear from some local students in Hartford, Connecticut, about how they're feeling about politics. Let us listen to what they got to say.
Most of our politicians are very old. We barely have any Gen Z politicians or representatives.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
There's so many issues going on in the world. There's housing crisis. There's inflation. There's like a problem with everything else in the world. And I just don't feel represented.
It's hard to feel comfortable in like a government where you don't feel represented.
Good to hear from Janae, Cheryl, and Cornelia there from Weaver High School in Hartford. Elena, what were your thoughts after hearing that clip?
I've definitely heard similar sentiment before over the last year of talking to people on this campaign of feeling that politicians take young voters for granted or don't think about their values enough. I think, though, that it's important to note that the conversation has potentially massively shifted because the Democrats have a new likely candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris, who is considerably younger than President Biden. And, that was a huge criticism of him among, Republicans, Democrats across age that, maybe this wasn't his time anymore. And so I'm very curious to get back out in the field. I'm hoping to do very soon to talk with people about how they feel about having a new potential leader of the party moving forward. And, I have just remotely been talking with people over the last few days, and a lot of, left-leaning folks are very excited about having a younger face, someone new at the top of the ticket potentially. And so I'm curious to see if Vice President Harris is able to kind of shift that feeling a little bit of not feeling as seen or represented. Obviously, she is not a millennial. She's almost 60, but she is a decades younger than President Biden.
It's not necessarily a new idea, Sally, that young people feel underrepresented in politics and they're not being listened to. So can you help me where that might be echoed throughout time? Is this something we see in every generation, in fact, or is this something unique happening right now in terms of maybe the feeling being enhanced because of all this unprecedented stuff? What are your thoughts?
I mean, my thoughts are that both are right. Young people not feeling represented. I'm thinking of, again, going back to the 1960s and the Vietnam War, and how do you get through to the older generation? But I'm also, as Jean said, we're living longer. Our leaders have been older, and so is the feeling of underrepresentedness more important now, or more likely to come up now because of we're living longer, because of who the current leaders are?
Folks living longer than ever before, you just said, and that also means they're maintaining their jobs for longer than they used to. Maybe a good thing for the older generation, but is that alienating younger cohorts from getting involved in politics? I mean, this is what we've talked about for a long time now. We hear about term limits a lot. We hear about people's age. What do you gather there, Sally?
I mean, I don't know if people sort of job-wise are asking to, are telling millennials to, or telling older voters to get out. But and certainly, as we're seeing, millennials and Gen Z are getting involved. So I don't think that that people living longer hurts political involvement of young people. Just going back to what you said about representation, the current set of leaders plus people living longer makes it more likely that people will feel unrepresented. But in terms of involvement, I don't think you see a decrease in involvement.
Gen Z and millennials differ from Gen X, boomers, and the silent generation in a huge way that we can't overlook. And of course, you mentioned was a big barometer here, Gene. They grew up with access to the internet, devices, phones. Just help us now understand how that plays a role into their political leanings.
Yeah, so there's a number of factors here. So, in talking about living longer, and that's a byproduct of technology, and it means that with people living longer and keeping those political jobs longer, that there's a bigger generation gap between the youngest adults and the leaders in many cases, and we've seen that play out. And then there's also the gap of technology in terms of how people communicate. So the silent generation, Joe Biden's generation, still reads newspapers a lot of times. Even if they don't read it on paper, they're reading a newspaper and newspaper stories. Much less common for Gen Z, who's much more likely to get their news from TikTok.
And that's where I kind of want to go, because we were talking about Kamala Harris becoming so popular, particularly of what's happening on TikTok right now. Help us understand then, and let's lean into that more on how Gen Z feels about politics this election cycle, maybe because of what they're seeing on TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, we have to realize that obviously we're overgeneralizing. That happens a lot when you talk about generations. But some people, especially when they're talking about the workplace with generations, they'll sometimes say that the boomer wants to meet you in person or call you on the phone. The Gen Xer wants to send you an email. The millennial wants to text you, and the Gen Zer wants to send you their resume as a TikTok video. The thing is, there's very few boomers who are on TikTok. So there's this generational gap in where people get their news and how they communicate, not just in what they're talking about and their attitudes and their behaviors and so on. It's good that, younger people have a way to get information. It's just the problem is that social media in particular tilts negative, tilts toward things that make people angry and upset, because that's how the algorithms work. As a general principle, lots of social psychology studies showing this. But it can at times have more positive impacts if people learn, information about new political candidates and so on. And that can raise awareness among a population who is often not as politically engaged as older generations would like that younger generation to be.
So it sounds like it's got to be misinformation versus actually being informed. So if we get closer to informing people, that's when it can help, Gene?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the problem is one person's misinformation is another person's facts these days. So it's very difficult to parse these things.
Got another clip for Elena here. 2 more students from Weaver, Hartford, and what they had to say that involved social media.
I mean, there is more topics to be worried about, like how we were talking about gun violence and stuff like that. Like, they should be looking at something like that more instead of worrying about one app.
Like, I understand our security is at risk, but our lives are at risk in school too. So that should be important, just as important as TikTok. And they should actually focus more on that.
Thank you to Cheryl and Carnelia, students at Weaver Hartford, for that tape. Two really important issues brought up here. Access to TikTok, Elena, and their worry that politicians seem more interested in banning the app than they do about protecting them from gun violence in schools. Well, what are your thoughts on those comments from the students, Elena?
I think that the starting on gun violence, it's one of those things where this is an issue we've seen mobilize young people. As we said, a lot of young people have grown up with school shooting drills constantly, or they've known someone or been involved in a mass shooting themselves. But I think that this is one of those moments where there's a communications flop in some ways, because the White House has made gun violence prevention and curbing gun violence a big part of their presidency. President Biden's presidency and Vice President Kamala Harris, they've established an Office of Gun Violence Prevention. There's steps that the party has taken to address this issue. And I've definitely talked to a lot of young people who don't know about these things. And that's not to say anything close to the issue is solved. But, on some of these topics, things have, politicians are trying. And I think so in some ways there's a communication, wires crossed of, not everyone is getting the information on some of these things, but also are politicians telling the right people about it. At the same time, I think that larger idea of, you're focusing on banning this app that we actually really like and is helpful for us when there are all these other things going on. I've definitely heard versions of that. And it gets back to what we were saying before of, do politicians know what young people are feeling? And I think that the TikTok conversation is complicated because it's a place where people often go to experience joy and be, entertainment. Politics and TikTok may overlap more than we think. It's just going to be in an entertainment-y way.
A complete reversal here, a 180 in terms of what we saw with the president and all this talk about Biden's age and cognition, seeing him drop out of the race. This must have been incredible to be following if you were in an older generation. Help me out with this, Sally. Did you see this as ageism at any point? And do we undervalue our elder politicians? Is that a fair question to ask at this time, Sally?
I feel like in this case, it was a mix. It's easy when you're 20 years old to just ageism. Yeah, 70 is old or 80 is old. And just sort of, put the stereotypes out there. So I feel like, yeah, ageism, but also in this case, the cognition issue, the debate performance, the not getting better performances since the debate. Yeah, I feel like ageism and cognition issues are there. And also that it's too bad for Biden that everything got so public, that his party leaders had to come out so publicly. Hey, we think you should get out. I feel bad for him.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking generational theory 101 today. Are you part of the silent generation? Are you a boomer, Gen X, millennial? Any Gen Z listeners? I don't know if my kids are listening. What about a Gen Alpha here? Are you listening right now on a radio, you on your iPhone? We're breaking down how your generation is leaving its mark on politics. Stick with us. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. When our CT Public reporters Abby Brown and Eddie Martinez went out to interview folks on the street about their generations and politics, they got some good insight on what issues are bringing folks to the polls this November.
We're not asking who you're voting for, but do you plan to vote in this presidential election? You do?
Oh, yeah.
And why do you think it's important?
Because we have to keep our country from going to crap. I shouldn't have said that.
LGBTQ rights and like access to like trans healthcare and like not having like a president or a government that's going to like attack me for that.
Immigration, either let all the people in, make them pay taxes, or have a process that works.
Jobs, as far as like help, like insurance is sky high. You know, it's certain benefits that I would like to have, but I can't get because I don't qualify.
Obviously, economics is a big priority. Inflation. I'd say probably the issue of Roe v. Wade is very important to me.
So you're not going to be able to vote in this election, but are you still planning to keep tabs on what's happening?
Definitely, yeah. I'm very interested in politics.
Are you planning to vote in this election year?
Yes, I do plan to vote. You know, I wasn't born in this country. I am certainly a citizen, but I haven't really thought too much about following a particular party or anything. I just, you know, would like to see that we don't have a two-party system. That's my belief. Gun issues is something that I don't have the same experience because there's a huge gun law in Australia and there is in other countries as well, not just, Australia. So I feel that that's something that should be a number one topic.
The environment, we're both environmental studies majors, and so that's something we're talking a lot about.
If you have no environment, you're going to have nobody, so the rest of it doesn't matter.
The changing of our Supreme Court and all the issues around freedoms.
Right now, politically, the biggest thing is the state of our court system. The Supreme Court's making rulings that don't really make sense and haven't made sense, and they're pretty conservative, and that's obviously known, but I feel like it's kind of dangerously conservative.
Just wanted to give people an idea of what people on the streets are talking about. Anything that caught your ear in that, Sally?
I like the honesty of the people. The first person was like, "Hey, this is a bunch of crap." I just like the way some of them said what they said, but how many issues, some of the issues those people said, those young people said were similar to what's going on in the national polls. So there's some generational stuff going on, but some of the issues sort of cut across generations as well.
Yeah, I noticed many of the same things that Sally did. A lot of these are generational universals, or due to demographic factors other than generation. But generally speaking, you're going to hear more about LGBT and trans rights from Gen Z. They've grown up with that. They take it much more for granted. They are incredulous when some older generations, want to take steps, in the other direction. A lot of stuff around jobs is going to be much more front of mind for people who are younger and not retired. But then there's other issues like gun violence, which cut across generations. Abortion does too, but just because of the reproductive lifespan, that's going to have a much bigger personal and individual impact on younger people. So I think there is a pronounced generational divide often on abortion, even though there are people who are on both sides in every generation. But who it has an impact on is going to generally be young women.
Elena, in talking to some of the Gen Zers that we spoke to, again, we only spoke to 5. We did hear a lot about reproductive rights, and we also heard about the environment. We heard about shootings. Those were mostly what we heard about. Is that tracking to what folks that you're talking about are talking with you about?
Yeah, I think those are all top issues, and we know that organizing around gun violence prevention and addressing climate change, we've seen massive marches on those topics, and then we know that that young people and folks of other generations too, but we've seen noticeably that protecting abortion access is a motivator for young people to turn out to vote. We've seen that really since the fall of Roe v. Wade. And that's something that Democrats and Republicans are aware of, that this is a motivating issue for voters to come out. And that's why you see Vice President Harris saying it so much on the campaign trail, even before she was the presidential candidate. And that's also why we've seen former President Trump kind of change his messaging, say it's a states issue, instead of kind of harping on that, I appointed these, him saying he appointed these justices. But back to your question is, I think that, I have heard these things. And the bigger point I wanted to mention is that young voters, they really care about issues much more than they do about party preference. And the Harvard Youth Poll, which surveys voters under 30, comes out twice a year. Their spring survey showed that party preference is fairly split. It's a little over a third identify as Democrats, more than a third identify as independents, and around a quarter identify as Republicans. So there is a left skew there, but not huge. And I think it kind of exemplifies this bigger thing of people want to talk about, how they're going to afford to go to school, and if they're going to have access to healthcare, and if they're going to, be able to feel safe in a place. And I think that those are the things that people want to talk about, their issues. And then from there, politicians, can fall on one or one side of it, and I think calling this a generation that is a Democratic Party generation is not necessarily fair, because they're motivated by the issues. And right now, some of those issues are things Democrats have championed.
We talked about there how Gen Zers can lean on either side of the aisle here. Are we seeing that in different generations, Gene? Is it one of those situations where it's not necessarily that people that are older than Gen Zers are all conservative? Help us understand. That's an obvious statement there, but help us understand how this might skew in any direction.
Yeah. So, and we are talking about skews of really a few percentage points. On the other hand, the last few elections have been decided by just a few percentage points. So these are important differences. Gen X does lean more Republican. Millennials do lean more Democrat. Gen Z in many ways are still somewhat of an unknown quantity. We do know that more high school seniors, for example, are identifying at the extremes of political ideology. So more identify as very liberal than a few decades ago, but then also more identify as very conservative, reflecting the political polarization, in the rest of the culture and in the rest of the generations. And, there's been some ups and downs with politics, because in the last election, Gen Z tilted, pretty strongly Democrat, partially because they're young adults. Even those who were Republicans were less likely to vote for Trump than of other generations. So even the young adult Republicans were less likely to vote for Trump than, say, the older generation Republicans. But then, in this most recent, in the election year we're in now, there's been a lot of polls suggesting that Gen Z was tilting more Republican now. We don't know a whole lot, partially because things are changing so fast. So I think Gen Z is a big question mark in this upcoming generation, because as a group of young adults, they do tilt more liberal. On the other hand, they're very negative and very pessimistic, as I was mentioning before. And that is not a good sign for the incumbent party, which in this case is the Democrats.
Again, the impression that we're getting is that folks can skew more conservative as they get older. At least that's a stereotype. I just wanted you to weigh in here, Sally.
As you get older, you get more conservative. I still don't think that means that baby boomers, even if they have gotten more conservative, sort of outrank Gen X on conservativeness.
Okay, so we're getting towards the main event here, this year's election. As we close out the show, I'd love for each of you quickly, in less than a minute, help us understand how generations will see each candidate. Go ahead, Sally, you start first.
So I've been thinking a lot about, okay, so here's Harris's honeymoon. So what's, it's going to devolve into a regular old campaign at some point. But as Elena said, the excitement among young people, the TikTok, Harris using a Beyonce song. So at the moment, I think the Harris candidacy speaks great for the most recent generations.
Gene, what are your thoughts?
Well, anybody's guess. But yeah, Kamala Harris is at the very last few months of the baby boom generation by most definitions. She was born in October 1964. So we can make her an honorary Gen Xer, those of us who would like to. And it's certainly going to bring more of that perspective to politics, to this election than when we were talking about, two candidates both born in the 1940s. It's a whole new ballgame.
Elena, you get to finish out. You mentioned earlier that we had this reaction on TikTok. There is the Beyonce song. It's not just on TikTok. There seems to be a lot more of a different tenor around this race than when I went out with Eddie and Abby to talk to people. That's why we didn't feature some of those answers that we asked about the race, because those would certainly change. So just what are your last thoughts here, Elena, on what folks are saying, what folks that you talk to are saying about this race?
I think, Harris has a lot of momentum and excitement right now, both from some young voters and also larger Democratic leadership and the party. But I've talked to some young folks who say, these are fun, but they're waiting to hear her talk policy. I've talked to young people who are concerned about the ongoing Israel-Hamas war and want to see how she discusses that policy, and that could influence their vote. I've talked to other people who are just really concerned that she could, potentially, in their words, take young voters for granted. And I think that gets back to what I was saying earlier of this is a very issue-driven generation. And they love a good meme, they love a good laugh, but at the same time, they are really keen on policy and finding out, how their futures are going to look. And just really quickly, I think on the polls, we're kind of resetting in some ways. Biden was losing support and struggling among young voters, but it's been, a really tough few months for him in this age group, and Harris is entering that with a very different message. So I'm very interested to see how this generation looks to her. And I think last thing I'll say is both Democrats and Republicans have told me that, they blame the other side for the catalyst of their generation's political awakening. Democratic organizers will say, our generation is shaped by Trump and the things he's done. But I've talked to Republicans who say that they're shaped by the things that they disagree with Biden over. And so I think this upcoming vote, we'll see how that translates. But both these men, Trump and Biden, have shaped this young vote generation, and we'll see what they have to say about it.
Thank you so much to Sally Friedman, Gene Twangy, and Elena Moore for doing just tremendous work, helping us understand how the generations see politics. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Frankie.
Today's show was produced by Chloe Wynn. It was edited by Wheelhouse executive producer Katie Tularski. Thank you to Meg Dalton and Robin Doyen-Aiken for helping with show content. We also want to extend a big thank you to our reporters in the field. Thank you, Eddie Martinez and Abby Brown, for doing the Wheelhouse in the wild. That was a lot of fun. Our technical producer today is Bradley O'Connor. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.